Hello, I'm Michael Cummin and welcome to Echoes from the Margins, the monthly companion series to Mind the Gap. I've often found myself off to the side, observing more than performing, asking more than answering. A bit of a margin dweller, if you like. And I say that not with regret, but with something close to gratitude. For over 30 years, I've worked in two fields. One, developing new and young leaders and managers. The other in communications and broadcasting, but always with the sense that I wasn't in the centre, but on the margins. Because from the margins, you see things differently. You notice the quiet ones, the people who don't compete for attention, but hold it gently. You hear the stories that don't make headlines, but matter deeply. And you learn that silence, restraint, or simply waiting your turn to speak, that these aren't signs of weakness. They're forms of wisdom. That's what this series is about. Echoes from the Margins is not a podcast about being loud or polished or definitive. It's a space to listen to ideas, traditions, and emotions that often go overlooked. We'll explore global philosophies, emotional intelligence, unspoken truths, and moments of quiet clarity. You'll hear insights from philosophers, Indigenous thought, poetry, and the corners of life that are rarely lit. So if you've ever felt out of step with the crowd or simply tired of the noise, you're in good company here. From the margins, there's a different kind of view. The margins are shaped not only by geography or power, but by identity, by lived experiences of those whose gender, sexual orientation, class, ethnicity, or age has pushed them to the edges of visibility. They aren't abstract positions, they're often inherited or imposed. For many of us, they became places of observation long before they became places of choice. Some find themselves in the margins by design, choosing solitude, spiritual depth, or creative independence. Others are placed there by the system that overlooks or mislabels them. Either way, the margins are where insight survives, because they require us to see, to listen, and to live differently. The margins are not just where people are excluded, they're where different ways of knowing live. This series looks at the edges of culture, power, and noise to uncover insights often dismissed, the wisdom of the quiet person in the room, the unsent letter, the aging voice, the restrained protest, the non-Western tradition, the things left unsaid. The margins are where insight survives, softer, slower, and often more human. I've always been intrigued by the ones who don't say much. And this is somewhat in contrast to the work I do helping people with presentation skills. But the person in the meeting who doesn't jump in, the one whose words land heavier when they finally speak. The person in the meeting who doesn't jump in, but whose words land heavier when they finally speak. The teacher who commands attention not by raising their voice, but by lowering it. The friend who listens more than they talk, and yet somehow knows you better than you know yourself. We live in a world that confuses visibility with value, where performance is rewarded, where volume equals conviction, and where silence is often mistaken for weakness, or worse, indifference. But what if we've got it backwards? Well, today we begin with a different kind of leadership. One you won't find often in TED Talks or boardrooms or political campaigns. The leadership of presence, of restraint, of the quiet ones. Let's begin with my favourites, the Stoics. Epictetus once said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." It's the kind of quote you might find on a fridge magnet, but like many Stoic teachings, it goes deeper the longer you sit with it. The Stoics believed that speaking less was not passivity, it was power. Restraint wasn't a failure to act, it was a mark of discipline. Modern leadership science echoes this. A recent study found that quiet leaders, those who listen, who observe, who wait, often create more psychologically safe spaces for teams to contribute. Susan Cain, in her work on introversion, shows how quiet leadership can often be just as effective sometimes, or sometimes more so, than charismatic dominance. The quiet ones invite others in, rather than taking up all the air. In Zen Buddhism, there's a saying, the quieter you become, the more you can hear. Zen leaders value stillness, not as a retreat from the world, but as a posture of clarity. Silence isn't empty, it's generative. In fact, in some Buddhist councils, it's custom to pause after each person speaks, to fully take in what's been said before moving forward. Can you imagine that at your next meeting? We find something similar in Indigenous leadership, especially amongst First Nations and Maori traditions. In some councils, elders may wait hours before speaking, not because they lack something to say, but because wisdom isn't rushed. As one observer put it, speaking without listening is considered a kind of theft. So why do we overlook these leaders? Because we're conditioned to equate loudness with certainty and certainty with strength. But what if loudness is sometimes a mask for fear? Fear of not being seen or not being right. A Zen teacher once wrote, grounding in presence helps leaders face chaos. Grounding in absence allows them to be resilient, compassionate, and wise. That paradox of strength through stillness is everywhere if we pay attention. Think of Rosa Parks. A single word. No. Softly spoken. Unshaken. That word echoed across decades, not because it was loud, but because it was immovable. Or Dag Hammarskjöld, the former UN Secretary General, who wrote in his journal, "The longest journey is the journey inward." His leadership wasn't built on showmanship, but on service. Or John O'Donoghue, the Irish poet, who led with presence, inviting people into stillness and wonder. Some quiet lives are shaped not only by temperament, but by how the world responds to difference. For those who are neurodivergent, whether autistic, highly sensitive, or living with ADHD, the margins can become familiar not by choice, but by necessity. Sensory overload, social complexity, or unspoken rules can push someone to the edge of a room or a conversation. And yet from that edge, many observe deeply, feel fully, and think differently, all essential forms of wisdom. And then there are those who simply don't fit the boxes, the ones whose identities, interests, or ways of being don't conform to the tidy segments designed by marketeers and the media. Too old for this demographic, too complex for that campaign, too fluid for fixed categories. They're often overlooked not because they are voiceless, but because no one listens in their direction. Let me ask you this. Who are the quiet ones in your life? Maybe it's a grandparent who didn't say much, but whose silence filled a room with calm. A colleague who doesn't rush to offer opinions, but always speaks the truth when it counts. Or maybe, at some point, it was you. If so, hold on to that. In a time of constant opinion, algorithmic outrage, and urgency as a virtue, the greatest power may be found in what we choose not to say. So here's a thought. What if being quiet is not about retreat, but about refining? What if the quiet ones aren't absent, but are simply choosing not to shout? And what if, just maybe, the loudest voice in the room isn't the strongest, but the one who's most afraid of not being heard? Until we meet again, tread gently and let the quieter voices guide you.